Welcome, everyone, to this week's Moments of Grace, our episode 12, Resurrection and Hope, with Bishop Jake Owensby. Bishop Jake, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
For those of you who don't know, Bishop Jake is the fourth bishop of the Diocese of Western Louisiana, and he is also author of numerous books. But for our purposes today in this discussion, most notably A Resurrection-Shaped Life, which is a book that we're going to be using at Grace at the end of April and going into May as part of our book group. And forthcoming, very shortly forthcoming, is his next book, Looking for God in Messy Places. And we're going to have a little bit of discussion right towards the end of this today as well. So, Jake, I just wanted to start out in kind of looking at the book of A Resurrection-Shaped Life and getting excited about reading it and discussing it with our people at Grace. My first question is, how does the resurrection of Christ enable us, and I want to say in an authentic and faithful way, how does it enable us to really wrestle with things like suffering that you hit upon in the book?
Thank you. I think that's a question that a lot of people have. A lot of people wrestle with suffering. And I believe that the Christian faith, and I'm not knocking any other faith traditions, but I think the Christian faith has a very honest and helpful approach to suffering. So let me start by saying a word about resurrection in general. My take is that resurrection, of course, has to do with life after life. We do believe that the grave is not the end; it's a place of transformation and transition for us. But it would be selling the resurrection short, as it were, to not acknowledge that it's actually something that begins happening now, not in its fullness, but it's the decisive act of God's love right in the middle of human existence as we experience it now. We could talk about that sacramentally, if we wanted to do that. But what I want us to understand is that God is at work. So God is present in loving us right in the midst of every messy place in our lives. And suffering is one of those messy places. Suffering poses a tremendous challenge to us, doesn't it? It makes us wonder if this life was really worth it. Will it have come to nothing? And what God's presence does for us is to say that all will be all right in the end. And if it's not all right, this isn't the end. Right in the midst of it. Now, I kind of go back and forth between a resurrection-shaped life and looking for God in messy places. So forgive me for doing that. But one of the deep learnings for me, the existential learnings for me, was to visit the concentration camp in which my mother was imprisoned, and to read accounts of life in a concentration camp. And the accounts of Eddie Hillesum, for example, who is a tremendous person of faith, a person of the Jewish faith, tells us that even in those most dire circumstances where suffering is so profound and apparently senseless, an awareness of God's presence that leads us then to give love to other people and to look toward, even in the midst of that, loving our neighbor in very concrete ways, gives suffering meaning. It prevents suffering from stripping life of its meaning and its sense of purpose and value, and teaches us that, not to put too fine a point on it, that even in the midst of suffering like that, there is new life at the other end of it. I don't mean to say that suffering is just something we have to endure, that we simply say, well, this will be over. But because God is with us and we can have the awareness of that, we can genuinely draw on our experience of ourselves as God's beloved. I'll put it a slightly different way. I was listening to Abide With Me earlier today, which just, it's so lovely. And I was struck with the realization that God has us in God's hands, in God's grasp, in God's hold perpetually. Our awareness of that, of course, is intermittent. But it's in our awareness that we are held by God that we begin to get a hint of being a resurrection person. And so that, I hope that answers your question. Nothing makes suffering just go away. Nothing makes it all right. Suffering isn't there to make us a better person. Suffering is just a brute fact of human existence. And what I always ask is not, why did this happen to me? But because I've experienced God's presence, as I'm sure you have too. I asked, what do you suppose God is doing with this? What is God making of this? So that's, so, I don't want to in any way suggest that, suffering isn't important because God is at work in it. What I want to say is we are so important to God that God will not let suffering ruin our lives. I think that may summarize it best of all, truthfully. I'll leave it at that. I hope I answered your question.
Absolutely. And I think that transition that you made there at the end from why, if we can shift that to how are we going to live with this, such an important thing for faith and indeed hope. And I took note that in a couple of the reviews of the book, A Resurrection Shaped Life, a couple of the reviewers really appreciated how you spoke about hope. One said that hope is not just, slapping a smiley face on something. And another reviewer said how they appreciated that you took us from this kind of idea of an optimism to hope. So I'm wondering if you could just flesh out a little bit more how the resurrection in real ways gives us hope.
Thank you. I don't want to diminish anyone's sense of the power of believing in a life after life, because I do believe that. But my hope, and I believe the hope that Paul is talking about, for instance, derives not from how things are going to turn out, but rather my hope derives, and I think Paul is teaching us that this is where hope derives, is, let me put it this way. When I talk about experiencing God's presence, I'm really not just talking about seeing God. Okay, some folks think about maybe having an experience of God over there, and God really is. And that's, I don't want to say that that's a bad or false thing, but I'm going to tell you something that's more powerful for me, is that in my experience of God's presence, and I think if you read the mystics, frequently you'll see this. It's not just seeing God, it's being seen, being beheld, not just loving God because of God's beauty and goodness and grandeur, but rather feeling yourself as God's beloved. When we know that we are loved in this way, when we are held by God's love for us, we know ourselves as God's beloved. And interesting, how Paul weaves together faith, hope, and love, huh? What I hear Paul teaching us is that when we feel ourselves, and I mean really feel it in our gut, in our heart, in our soul, when we feel ourselves as the beloved, then we're on the road to becoming who we most truly are. We were created in the image of God. And to be who we most truly are is to live into that image. And God is love. And so embodying a compassion that is always gift, for whatever reason, I believe, God so made us that that's where we sense that this life is really worth living. This is worth it, no matter what. No matter how tough things get, this love I'm able to give away because it's been given to me keeps me going. It's the wind in my sails. Now, I don't want to in any way tell people don't have wishful thinking, even though hope is more than wishful thinking. Look, let's face it. Optimism isn't a bad thing. The idea that things will turn out the way you wish for them to, that motivates lots of people. It motivates me sometimes in ministry ideas. Well, watching football games, I hope my team will win, right? But that's that's not sustaining hope, because if everything hinges on the external circumstances and the way things will turn out, that's always contingent, isn't it? It cannot turn out that way. And then where are you? But an experience that the all-powerful, all-loving, completely reliable God has you in a loving grasp that won't relent, that is always about making you whole and making you who you're truly meant to be. Now, that's a source of hope that doesn't go away. That's that sort of ever-flowing stream that wells up within us, that propels us into being able to do all those loving things Jesus teaches us to do, like forgive people who've injured us, love our enemies. And I'll tell you a tough one for so many people I've talked to: forgive themselves, right. Love themselves. All of that, I think, has its root in discovering ourselves as God's own beloved child. So I go along with Richard Rohr's taught me a lot, and I like what he says. God is always present, and our great challenge spiritually is to be aware of that. And I'm not blaming people for their lack of awareness. It's just, it's our growing edge. It's just our growing edge as human beings.
Well, and sources of hope are so important. And baseball season has just begun. Every year I begin with a whole lot of hope. And every year for the last 30 years, I've been disappointed as a Minnesota Twins fan. And so, at an early age, I had a lot of hope in my sports teams, but at some point, probably later than others, I realized I need a source of hope, which is much more solid than so many places of hope that we all try to dip into and out of. I'm going to take the guess that we find our sources of hope in some unlikely places and at some unlikely times. And in saying that, I want to transition to what inspired you to write a book called Looking for God in Messy Places. And where are some of the messiest places should we be ready to find God and to find hope?
Oh, thank you for asking that. I'll tell you what I've really been struck by in our nation in particular, but I think it's worldwide. There are several things that intersect or coalesce or just come together that the great author and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl would have called symptoms of a crisis of meaning. And I see that using, of course, my Christian lenses, as seeing those as crisis of hope. We are in an epidemic of violence. The number of mass shootings that we have is, I tell you, Bryce, it's almost numbing. It's so frequent. Huh? We're in the middle of an epidemic of drug addiction and with that overdoses. And so that correlates, I think, to a certain level of despair. And speaking of despair, the suicide rates have been increasing. Because my eldest son is a combat veteran and doing very well, but many of his colleagues, have not done so well, and that there's an epidemic of suicides among veterans, but also across the United States population. So as I looked at this world that you and I inhabit on a daily basis, I began to sort of, through compassion, feel the ache. I recognize that we're in a kind of, we're in a crisis of hope. And I wanted to find a way to help people find hope. That's what really, it wasn't some theological wondering about, gee, I wonder what Paul meant by hope. Although, I do that too, but it's, or what would Jesus tell us to do to take hold of hope. But where I began was to see the pain around me, And I have to tell you, life is just in general pretty messy right now. We're facing racial tensions that, they've been there because of injustice and the depths of racism in our nation. And we're facing economic despair among folks who are in the working class because they're falling farther and farther behind economically. And I recognize, at least I believe I recognize, that people, lots and lots of us, find life as such a difficult place to navigate. But I'll tell you something. A lot of the people in our pews, right? I mean, a lot of them are under the impression that they got to look like they've arrived, right? I mean, they really do. I mean, there's a lot of pressure among the professional classes and so forth to look like I got it all together. And I bet you've had this experience too. The more and more you have pastoral conversations with people, the people that you love, and they know you love them, and they'll tell you the truth, right? They're going to say, hey, here's what's going on in my life. I'm worried about my teenage kids, or my marriage is rocky, or my career, I'm really not satisfied in it. I reached this place of success, and I ask myself the question, is this it? And one thing after another, you realize, people hide their sorrows. They don't want people to know that their life is messy. And I want to help people know that, actually, human existence, it's always messy. And God isn't a God who's expecting us to get it all together so that then God will show up and not get dirt under the divine fingernails, right? But instead, the great good news to me, the good news of the incarnation to me is, guess what? This is the God who shows up no matter what. This is the God who actually really loves humanity just the way we are, will dwell right in the midst of us, because that's what God wants to do. And when we realize it, life's never quite the same again. So the messy places of life, wherever you show up, that's where it is. If you're loving, and that's what we're really, really built to do, life is going to get messy. If nothing else, I bet you've done plenty of funerals. To love means you're going to get your heart broken. It's that simple. We're joined at the hip, only, walking one another home, only to know that one of us is going to get there before the other. I get notes from my readers on my blog and in social media and in emails, recounting stories of losing loved ones to suicide, or to addiction, or to just family dysfunction. And people don't want to, they don't want to talk about it because they're sure that, well, everybody else has got it together. And what I want folks to understand is, that whole normal word, let's ditch that. Let's just admit that we're all flawed, we're all messy, we are all dependent upon God to get through another day. And if we can do that together with compassion, life's going to be more meaningful. So I may have answered a slightly different question there, but that's where I come to with the idea of human messiness.
I think ultimately how important it is to have a realistic hope in the face of messy places and in the face
Hmm.
of we're all messed up, and
Hmm.
we're not all going to none of us are going to measure up to that commercial or to that ad that we see every day.
Gosh, yeah, you're so right.
I
You're
think
so right. Yeah, and what a weight that stuff lays on us, right? That we're supposed to look like our bodies are supposed to look like the person who clearly spends 8 hours a day at the gym, or all of our cars are supposed to be the brand new car, or well, you better go run get the newest Apple Watch, whatever, right? And that really messes with our heads. And if we can accept ourselves as imperfect, as flawed, and each other as imperfect and flawed, um, love can happen. Love can happen. I just wrote some the other day. One of the biggest challenges in life, and what Jesus is teaching forgiveness is all about. Teaching about forgiveness is all about is being able to forgive the world for being flawed. Not just that one person who injured you, but that we're in a messy world. And so, how do we lean into that world? And I think that's what hope does. I think that hope gives us the momentum, the power to lean into a flawed world with a compassionate heart.
Well, I think as you mentioned earlier on, the life of Christ, the incarnation, from the incarnation to the grave, to the empty tomb, gives
Mm-hmm.
us the hope to look honestly at all of these things and honestly at ourselves as well. So I'm looking
Yes.
forward so much to the book group coming up and to more discussions as we go forward. But I want to give you the chance for a closing word today.
Well, you know what? If I wanted anybody to remember just one thing from anything I ever say, is remember that you're God's beloved child. That's the game changer. And nothing can ever take that away from you. That's the source of hope. It's what gives us the capacity to love. And I think it grounds our faith. You're the beloved child of God.
I always like the ability to end these on an amen, and I think you've just given us the perfect thing to say amen to. Thank you so much, Bishop Jake, for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Great to be with you. I look forward to that as well.